Did you ever notice how the quietest places tend to hide the loudest stories? Picture this. A sun-drenched street in Montecito. Palm trees barely moving. Gates closed. Cameras blinking silently. Everything looks perfect. Too perfect. And yet, behind that calm exterior, something is said to have been unraveling. Slowly at first, then all at once. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Here's the question that hooked people instantly. How does someone end up accused of bullying an entire neighborhood in one of the most exclusive zip codes in America? That question alone lit up comment sections, podcasts, dinner tables, and late-night group chats. Because this wasn't just gossip. Not to the people following it closely. It was a collision of celebrity, privacy, power, and perception. And once those forces collide, nothing stays contained for long. Let's be clear about something from the start. What you're about to hear is not a court verdict. It's not a sworn testimony. It's a story shaped by claims, reactions, media framing, and the way narratives grow when famous names are involved. Allegations, disputes, interpretations. That distinction matters, because in this story, perception may be just as powerful as proof. So why does this matter now? Because Montecito isn't just a town. It's a symbol, a retreat for people who have everything and want nothing more than to be left alone. When a place like that becomes the backdrop for whispers of drone spying, neighborhood intimidation, and alleged forced exits, people pay attention. Not because they want to invade privacy, but because it raises an uncomfortable question. Can someone who demands privacy also be accused of violating it? That tension sits at the heart of this entire story. In the first few days after these claims started circulating, the headlines were dramatic. Some were careful. Others were anything but. Words like bullied, evicted, spying jumped off the screen, each one heavier than the last, each one inviting outrage before context. And context, as you'll see, is everything. But before any names were attached, before any alleged drones or neighbor disputes entered the conversation, there was Montecito itself. This place has rules, not written ones, unspoken ones, rules about discretion, about boundaries, about not rocking the boat, even if you don't like who's on it. Celebrities live next door to other celebrities, and the agreement is simple. Don't ask, don't tell, don't look too closely. That's how the peace is kept. Or at least, that's how it's supposed to work. Now imagine what happens when that balance is disturbed. When neighbors start to feel watched, or controlled, or unheard. Imagine how quickly small complaints can grow into collective resentment when nobody wants to be the first to speak. Because in places like Montecito, silence isn't emptiness. It's strategy. The early whispers didn't explode right away. They trickled. A comment here, a vague reference there. A neighbor allegedly telling a friend who told someone else. No names, no confirmation, just a feeling that something wasn't right. And that's often how the biggest stories begin. Then came the drone angle. Drones are strange symbols of our time. They're toys, tools, cameras, eyes in the sky. For some people, they represent innovation. For others, intrusion. In wealthy, privacy-obsessed enclaves, drones are especially sensitive. One wrong buzz overhead, and suddenly everyone's asking the same question. Who's watching who? According to claims that would later circulate, drones were allegedly spotted in places where they didn't feel welcome. Over hedges, near properties, close enough to make people uncomfortable, but distant enough to stay ambiguous. Were they even connected to anyone in particular? Were they recreational? Security-related? Something else entirely? That uncertainty is where anxiety grows. And anxiety doesn't stay quiet. As the narrative developed, it wasn't just about technology anymore. It became about behavior, about tone, about how neighbors allegedly felt spoken to or spoken about whether influence was being used to pressure, complain, or control. This is where one word started appearing again and again. Bullied. It's a strong word, an emotional word, one that instantly divides people. Some hear it and imagine shouting, threats, intimidation. Others understand that bullying can be subtle, bureaucratic, polite on the surface, suffocating underneath. Emails, complaints, requests, expectations. So let me ask you directly, can someone bully without raising their voice? That question sits uncomfortably at the center of this story. Then something happened that pushed these whispers into a different orbit. A familiar name entered the conversation. Lowe. For many people, that was the moment the story shifted. Not because he's a law enforcement official, not because he released documents, but because he's a longtime resident of the area and a figure widely seen as measured, private, and cautious with his words. When someone like that is even loosely connected to a controversial narrative, people lean in. What exactly did he say? What didn't he say? And why did the internet fill in the gaps so quickly? Some accounts claim he referenced neighborhood tensions. Others say his words were taken out of context. Supporters argue he was speaking generally, not accusing anyone. Critics insist his comments legitimized the allegations. And just like that, the story split into camps. Those who believed the claims immediately, those who dismissed them as exaggerated or malicious, and those who weren't sure what to think but couldn't stop watching. Here's where things get complicated. Because once the media got hold of the story, the language intensified. Alleged disputes became confrontations. Tensions became intimidation. A reported move became an eviction. Each retelling sharpened the edges, and audiences rarely see the edits. One outlet would say reportedly. Another would drop the qualifier entirely. Social media would take the boldest headline and strip it of nuance. Suddenly, a question becomes an accusation. You've seen this happen before, haven't you? And yet, despite the noise, one thing remained oddly consistent. No clear, definitive timeline. No single moment where everything exploded. Instead, a slow build. A pressure cooker effect. Neighbors allegedly feeling uneasy. Complaints said to be made. Silence following. And then, distance. Physical distance. The idea that someone might have been pushed out of a place like Montecito is shocking on its own. This is a town where people don't leave unless they want to. Or unless something makes staying uncomfortable. But was it really an eviction? That word matters more than people realize. Eviction implies force, authority, a line crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. Others argue it was simply a choice, a relocation framed dramatically by outsiders hungry for scandal. So which is it? That question remains unanswered, and it fuels everything that follows. Because if it was a choice, the narrative collapses. And if it wasn't, the implications are far bigger than one household. As the story continued to circulate, something else became noticeable. The silence. No lengthy statements. No emotional rebuttals. No detailed denials addressing every claim. Just quiet. And in the modern media landscape, silence is never neutral. Some see it as dignity. Others see it as confirmation. What do you see it as? That silence created a vacuum, and the internet rushed to fill it. Speculation flourished. Old grievances were re-examined. Patterns were suggested. Motives were assigned. And suddenly, this wasn't just about drones or neighbors. It was about power. Who has it? Who uses it? And who gets believed when stories clash? This is why the story refuses to fade. Because it taps into something deeper than celebrity gossip. It asks whether wealth and influence protect people or isolate them. Whether privacy can coexist with suspicion. Whether living behind gates really keeps conflict out or just hides it better. And perhaps most uncomfortably, it asks whether communities designed for peace are actually built on pressure. As we move forward, we're going to slow this story down. Strip away the shouting headlines. Examine the claims piece by piece. Look at how narratives form, harden, and sometimes break apart under scrutiny. We'll explore what Montecito is really like when the cameras aren't pointed at the gates. We'll look at how drones became symbolic villains. We'll unpack what bullying can mean when lawyers, assistants, and influence enter the room. And yes, we'll examine why Lowe's name became such a pivotal part of the conversation, fairly or not. But before we go any further, there's one last thing to understand. In stories like this, the truth isn't always a single straight line. It's layers, perspectives stacked on top of each other. Some accurate, some exaggerated, some shaped by fear, some shaped by resentment. And once those layers settle, removing them becomes nearly impossible. Because by then, the damage, or the misunderstanding, has already been done. And the next chapter doesn't start with a drone. It starts with the illusion of paradise itself. Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever looked at a postcard-perfect neighborhood and wondered what stories hide behind the manicured lawns, the pristine driveways, and the gates that promise safety? Montecito is that kind of place. From the outside, it's serene. The kind of calm that makes visitors sigh and say, I could live here forever. But paradise, as we're about to see, can be deceptive. This story begins not with drama, but with normalcy. Residents sipping coffee on sunlit patios. Joggers moving along tree-lined streets. Dogs trotting beside their owners. A neighborhood that appears peaceful in every photograph, every drone shot, every social media post. And yet, behind this perfect exterior, cracks were forming. Small, almost imperceptible. A whisper here, a sideways glance there. A rumor exchanged over garden fences. The tension didn't arrive with a bang. It crept in silently. But in places like Montecito, where privacy is law and discretion is currency, even a whisper can be explosive. Allegedly, there were complaints, some private, some not. Some official, some circulating quietly among neighbors. About what? Allegedly, behavior that seemed controlling, invasive, and occasionally confrontational. It wasn't the kind of confrontation that hits headlines immediately. It was the kind that grows in private conversations, in uneasy interactions, in the small acts that accumulate until the air itself feels heavy. You might be asking, how does a place designed for peace and seclusion end up feeling like a pressure cooker? The answer is simple, yet subtle. In elite neighborhoods, everyone watches everyone, but nobody admits it. Each resident is a public figure in their own right, even if not in headlines. Each house is a fortress. Each gate a line between control and chaos. When one person steps over the invisible line, the reaction can ripple through the entire community. And the first ripples were quiet. A drone buzzing overhead, dismissed as a hobbyist. A polite disagreement, shrugged off. A glance that felt too pointed, forgotten, or so people told themselves. But tension is like a shadow. It grows longer as the sun sets, and suddenly, what once seemed insignificant can become undeniable. In the beginning, no one wanted to admit what was happening. Why would they? A neighbor is a neighbor. Privacy is precious. Reputation is everything. But human nature, even among the wealthiest and most polished individuals, can't ignore repeated friction. And once suspicion takes root, it grows exponentially. Every unexplained action is magnified. Every ambiguous comment is analyzed. Every minor incident becomes evidence in an invisible trial. This is where the alleged bullying claims emerged. Not in court, not through formal channels at first, but in hushed conversations and private communications. According to reports circulating in media and online discussions, neighbors began to feel pressured, restricted, manipulated, or monitored in ways that seemed deliberate. The term bullying may feel extreme, but consider the context. It's not just loud, aggressive behavior. In elite enclaves, it can be subtle. A demand for compliance, a pointed suggestion, an expectation that everyone conform to unspoken rules. Allegedly, some neighbors felt that this pressure was relentless. The tension escalated, reportedly, when drones allegedly became involved. Not the casual, recreational kind. According to claims, drones were spotted where they shouldn't have been, hovering near private property, capturing angles that seemed intrusive, reminding neighbors that their sanctuary wasn't entirely safe. In a neighborhood where gates and privacy are sacred, a drone becomes more than a machine. It becomes a symbol, a threat, an accusation in motion. And then came the celebrity angle. Because this isn't just any neighborhood. Montecito is home to public figures whose names carry weight far beyond the streets they live on. And when the alleged incidents involved someone like Meghan Markle, everything intensified. Suddenly, the ordinary friction of private disputes became a matter of public intrigue. What some may have ignored as neighborly disagreements now felt like a story worth reporting, analyzing, and speculating upon. Enter Lowe, or rather, the claims surrounding what he allegedly said. Whether in interviews, conversations, or comments that leaked to the media, Lowe's name became part of the narrative. Why? Because he's respected, known for his discretion, and considered a stable voice in a high-profile community. Allegedly, his words gave weight to concerns that had existed quietly for months. Suddenly, what was once a private matter became fodder for speculation. And just like that, the peaceful facade began to crack. Alleged reports, media interpretation, and social media commentary combined into a storm that threatened to engulf the neighborhood. Every resident became part of a narrative they hadn't consented to, and every action was scrutinized. A glance could be misinterpreted. A complaint could be misrepresented. A polite request could be amplified into an accusation. But the most fascinating part? The alleged bullying, the drone sightings, the whispered tensions. They weren't the only elements at play. There was also the power of perception. Montecito thrives on appearances. Not appearances of wealth alone, but appearances of harmony, discretion, and order. When those appearances are threatened, the social pressure to conform and to resolve issues quietly becomes enormous. Allegedly, some residents felt cornered, isolated, or unheard. And the question began to emerge. When the gates close, who truly holds power? At this point, you may be wondering how the situation escalated to the point of alleged eviction or relocation. The key lies in perception versus reality. Allegedly, some neighbors saw certain actions as attempts to dominate or intimidate. Others saw them as misunderstandings, missteps, or overreactions. The ambiguity allowed tension to grow unchecked. It is often said that in conflicts like this, silence is the loudest statement. And silence, in Montecito, allegedly became deafening. The story of Montecito's cracks is more than the sum of its alleged incidents. It's about human behavior in extreme environments. It's about how discretion and privacy interact with suspicion and influence. It's about the way narratives evolve when public figures are involved. And it's about the fragile balance between community and individual authority, between peace and power, between perception and reality. So here's the question. Can paradise ever truly remain intact when every action is scrutinized, every word analyzed, and every person's motives questioned? Allegedly, the answer is no. Because paradise is an illusion if the underlying tensions are ignored. And when the illusion cracks, the consequences, both real and perceived, can be explosive. And just as the neighborhood's calm began to fracture, something else happened, something that would pull celebrity, media, and private citizen into a single, tangled narrative. A name, a claim, a whisper that turned into a headline. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever thought about what it means to live next door to a celebrity? Not just to see them on a screen, in movies, or on red carpets, but to exist in the same air, walk the same streets, and hear the faint echo of cameras, attention, and curiosity spilling into your quiet life? For many Montecito residents, that question isn't hypothetical. It's their daily reality. And reality, as we'll see, doesn't always match appearances. Imagine waking up to a sunlit morning, thinking it will be ordinary, only to realize that your peaceful street is suddenly alive with speculation. Because in places like Montecito, fame doesn't stay contained within walls. It leaks. It spreads. It colors perceptions. And when a neighbor becomes a headline, the neighborhood itself becomes a stage. That's where the tension began to shift. Allegedly, some residents noticed behavior that felt unusual. Perhaps it was too many visitors, too much attention, or an aura of scrutiny that felt personal. And then came the media, not reporters doing in-depth journalism, not cautious coverage, but the kind of attention that sensationalizes every whisper. Alleged bullying, eviction rumors, drone spying, headlines that demand clicks, likes, and shares before facts are confirmed. The fascinating part? Even if none of it were entirely true, perception had already done its work. The neighborhood, once quiet and controlled, suddenly felt exposed. Every glance, every gesture, every interaction was filtered through a lens of suspicion. Let's pause for a moment. Ask yourself this. If someone famous moves next door, how much of your reaction is about them? And how much is about what they represent? Power, influence, money, media attention. The way fame reshapes ordinary human behavior is subtle, yet profound. Neighbors might think they are responding to one person, but they are, in reality, responding to the concept of celebrity itself. And then, according to claims circulating in media reports, tensions escalated. Not with shouting, not with overt conflict, but with microaggressions, perceived slights, and actions interpreted as control or surveillance. The alleged drone sightings became symbolic in this context. A drone buzzing overhead could be harmless, playful even, but when it's tied to someone famous, it's no longer neutral. It becomes a statement, a challenge, an intrusion. This is where Lowe allegedly comes into the picture, not as an actor on a screen, but as a neighbor whose words and opinions carried weight. According to reports, his perspective was seen as validating certain concerns. And when a respected voice lends credibility to a rumor, even indirectly, the consequences ripple far beyond private conversations. Suddenly, what may have started as a series of minor incidents became a story that captured attention far beyond Montecito's gates. But here's the tricky part. Perception and intention are rarely aligned. Allegedly, some neighbors interpreted actions as bullying. Others saw misunderstandings. The truth is often in between, and when fame and media amplify the story, nuance is easily lost. One action can be painted as aggressive when it was polite. One glance can become a gesture of intimidation. In the public imagination, perception becomes reality. The next question is crucial. How does a neighborhood navigate the tension between private lives and public curiosity? Montecito is designed to protect privacy, gated streets, security measures, social norms. But as this story illustrates, privacy is fragile. When one neighbor allegedly feels watched, the ripple effect can unsettle the entire community. And then, there's the social aspect. Humans are inherently social creatures. In a neighborhood like Montecito, social reputation matters. Allegedly, some residents began to whisper among themselves, comparing experiences, sharing concerns, and building a narrative that reinforced their feelings. Group psychology is powerful, especially in small, wealthy, and high-profile communities. Once one person expresses discomfort, others may start seeing patterns that weren't obvious before. Here's a surprising fact. Studies in social dynamics suggest that people in close-knit, high-status groups are more likely to interpret ambiguous behavior negatively when reputation is at stake. In other words, the more everyone cares about appearances, the more easily misunderstandings escalate. Allegedly, that's exactly what happened in Montecito. And let's not forget technology. Social media, blogs, YouTube, and online forums act as accelerants. They take quiet neighborhood disputes and broadcast them to millions. Suddenly, what was once a minor tension becomes a public spectacle. Allegedly, snippets of conversations, observations about drones, and perceived slights were shared online, fueling speculation and controversy. Every new post was another lens refracting the story, making it more complex, more sensational, and more difficult to untangle. But perhaps the most human element is fear. The fear of being misunderstood. The fear of being publicly criticized. The fear that privacy is no longer a shield. Allegedly, these fears drove neighbors to act cautiously or defensively. Small complaints turned into larger ones. Conversations that should have resolved quietly remained unresolved. And tensions, as we know, do not dissipate on their own. So here's the question. When someone famous moves into your neighborhood, how much of the conflict is about them? And how much is about what they represent in terms of social dynamics, perception, and power? Allegedly, that distinction was at the heart of Montecito's unfolding drama. As this story developed, the drone sightings became more than just anecdotes. They became symbols of intrusion, control, and the fragility of trust. Allegedly, neighbors reported feeling monitored. Some said it was intimidating. Others dismissed it as paranoia. And the media amplified both perspectives, leaving viewers to wonder what was real and what was perception. And then, the narrative escalated when alleged bullying claims entered public discourse. Polite disagreements, subtle pressures, and interpreted slights were suddenly framed as a coordinated pattern. Allegedly, the neighborhood's calm facade was shattered, replaced by suspicion, fear, and heightened scrutiny. But here's where the drama deepens. Allegedly, some neighbors felt they had to take sides, while others wanted to remain neutral. The very social fabric that maintained harmony became strained. Even silence, in this context, was interpreted. Not responding could be seen as complicity. Speaking up could be seen as confrontation. Every action, or inaction, was scrutinized. And just when it seemed like tensions might resolve quietly, the story gained momentum beyond the streets of Montecito. Headlines, social media posts, and online discussions painted pictures of a neighborhood at odds. Allegedly, the drama was no longer contained. It had escaped. By now, you can see the pattern. Perception and influence, technology and fear, privacy and fame, all colliding in a neighborhood designed to avoid exactly this kind of scrutiny. Montecito's reputation as a peaceful enclave was being tested. Allegedly, what started as whispers among neighbors was evolving into a full-blown narrative, one that would draw attention from media outlets, celebrity commentators, and public curiosity alike. And yet, even amid all this noise, one truth remains. In neighborhoods like Montecito, silence is never neutral. Allegedly, the choice not to speak, or to speak carefully, has consequences. It shapes perceptions, fuels speculation, and sometimes escalates tension further. Which brings us to the key question: when a neighbor becomes a headline, how much control do they actually have over the story? Allegedly, very little. Because once perception takes hold, once fear spreads, and once media attention amplifies every nuance, the narrative can spiral beyond anyone's influence. And just as tensions were escalating, just as neighbors were interpreting every glance, every drone, every interaction through the lens of suspicion, another element entered the scene. Something that would push the story to a tipping point. Something that would transform private discomfort into public fascination. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Imagine this: a perfectly quiet Montecito morning, the sun casting golden light across manicured lawns, and suddenly, a small, mechanical hum overhead. A drone. At first, you might dismiss it. Maybe it's a hobbyist capturing footage for fun. But what if that small buzzing machine hovers near your property again and again? What if it seems to follow your movements, linger over private spaces, and capture angles that feel intrusive? In a community where privacy is sacred, a drone isn't just a gadget. It becomes a symbol, a perceived threat, an unwanted intrusion, a reminder that your sanctuary may not be as secure as it seems. According to claims circulating in media reports and online speculation, this is exactly what allegedly happened in Montecito. Residents reportedly noticed drones flying over private properties, sometimes hovering near homes where high-profile figures lived. The drones were said to appear at times when people were unaware, leading to unease and questions. Who was operating them, and why? Were they recreational? Security-related? Something else entirely? In an environment where every minor disturbance is amplified, the mere presence of drones raised alarm. Drones are complicated symbols. They're toys, tools, and cameras all at once. In the hands of hobbyists, they're harmless. In the hands of professionals or individuals with unclear intentions, they can feel invasive. In Montecito, where celebrities, executives, and public figures live side by side, the alleged drone sightings triggered intense speculation. The question hanging in the air was simple but powerful: who is watching, and for what purpose? This uncertainty is key. Humans are wired to respond to ambiguous threats with heightened attention. When an unfamiliar object appears repeatedly in your private space, your brain starts filling in the blanks. Was it an accident? Or was it deliberate? Allegedly, this psychological tension is what made the drone incidents so significant to neighbors. Even if no one could confirm who operated the drones, their presence alone created fear, suspicion, and anxiety. It's also important to consider the legal and ethical backdrop. Drone laws in California, and especially in high-profile areas like Montecito, are complex. Operators are restricted from flying over private property without consent, but enforcement is challenging. The technicality of the law often clashes with perception. A drone may be operating legally, yet residents can still feel violated. In Montecito, this clash between legality and perception fueled rumors and alleged complaints. According to reports, some neighbors claimed they observed drones at times and locations that felt deliberate. Some said the devices hovered long enough to take detailed photos or videos. Others suggested the drones were used to monitor the movements of individuals or gather information on properties. Allegedly, these incidents were interpreted as harassment or intimidation, a form of subtle bullying, some reports said. The concept of drones as surveillance tools is emotionally charged. Unlike a person peeking over a fence, a drone moves silently, observes from above, and captures images without immediate detection. The very invisibility of the device creates tension. Allegedly, that invisibility made it hard for residents to confront the perceived problem. Who could they address if the operator was unknown? Who could they report it to if the drones appeared sporadically and disappeared before anyone could react? This is where social dynamics come into play. Once a few residents reported or speculated about drones, word spread. Neighbors began comparing observations, connecting dots, and discussing patterns. Allegedly, some neighbors felt they were being watched not just by a machine, but indirectly by someone with influence. And in communities where reputation is paramount, the fear of being observed, of having private actions potentially exposed, can escalate tension rapidly. It's also worth noting the role of media and social perception. As drone allegations were shared online, they took on symbolic weight. A single incident could become representative of an entire neighborhood conflict. Allegedly, drone sightings became shorthand for deeper issues: control, invasion of privacy, and the alleged use of influence to unsettle neighbors. Whether or not the drones were actually linked to any particular individual, their repeated appearance fueled speculation. The situation was complicated further by the alleged presence of celebrities. Once a high-profile figure became involved in claims of drone sightings, the stakes increased dramatically. Attention intensified, scrutiny heightened, and every action, or perceived action, was dissected publicly. The drones were no longer just small mechanical devices. Allegedly, they were evidence in a narrative that painted someone as intrusive or controlling, whether that interpretation was accurate or not. And then there's the psychological factor. Humans tend to assign intention to unexplained events. A drone buzzing overhead is technically neutral, but in the context of Montecito, where privacy is prized and suspicion can run high, it's easy for residents to interpret neutral behavior as deliberate. Allegedly, the drones became a canvas upon which fears, frustrations, and assumptions were projected. What makes this story even more fascinating is the contrast between perception and reality. Some neighbors reportedly never saw drones at all. Others claimed multiple sightings, with details that didn't always align. The media, eager for attention-grabbing narratives, emphasized the most dramatic accounts. Social media amplified speculation, and by the time mainstream outlets reported on the alleged drone activity, the incidents had already taken on symbolic importance far beyond their initial scale. Allegedly, this symbolic weight intersected with other tensions in the neighborhood. Quiet disagreements, minor disputes, and perceived slights suddenly seemed part of a pattern. The drones weren't just machines in the sky. They were signs that privacy had been compromised, that control had shifted, and that a respected community boundary may have been violated. And yet, there is a crucial nuance to remember. Drones alone do not create conflict. They catalyze it. In Montecito, alleged drone sightings acted as triggers for existing tensions. If the environment had been entirely harmonious, a drone buzzing by might have been shrugged off. But when suspicions, fears, and social dynamics are already in play, even a small mechanical device can escalate into a major story. Audience question: if a neighbor installed cameras that you couldn't see, how would you feel? Now imagine those cameras are invisible and airborne. That's the psychological effect alleged drones reportedly had in Montecito. Even without concrete proof of intention, the sense of surveillance altered behavior, heightened anxiety, and shaped perceptions. By now, it's clear that these drones, real or perceived, were catalysts in a larger narrative. They amplified fears, fueled speculation, and became central to allegations that someone had bullied the neighborhood. But as important as the drones were, they weren't the entire story. Allegedly, the real drama emerged when respected voices weighed in. When neighbors, celebrities, and media personalities began interpreting these incidents, the narrative transformed from a quiet dispute into a full-blown public spectacle. And just as attention began to mount, one voice allegedly entered the conversation in a way that would tilt perceptions dramatically. Someone whose reputation carried weight, someone who neighbors and the public would listen to carefully. A person whose commentary could validate, amplify, or complicate the story even further. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever noticed how one name can suddenly change the way a story is perceived? One voice, calm and respected, can lend weight to whispers, turn speculation into seeming fact, and make people lean in, even when there's no confirmed evidence. In Montecito, That name allegedly became Rob Lowe. Rob Lowe isn't just any neighbor. He's an actor, a public figure, and someone widely regarded as measured, discreet, and thoughtful. But in a neighborhood like Montecito, being a celebrity is different than being famous elsewhere. You are part of a delicate ecosystem where every word, every gesture, every subtle opinion matters. Allegedly, when Lowe reportedly commented, directly or indirectly, on the tensions involving drone sightings and neighborhood friction, it sent ripples that amplified the story far beyond what had been circulating quietly. Here's the thing. The moment a respected voice weighs in, perception shifts. Some residents reportedly felt validated. Others became defensive, and the public, hungry for detail, immediately interpreted any comment as confirmation of the alleged drama. Media outlets picked up fragments of interviews, tweets, or offhand remarks, framing them in ways that maximized clicks and engagement. Allegedly, Lowe's alleged statements about neighborhood bullying or maintaining peace were repeated, shared, and dissected across social platforms, fueling a growing narrative. But what did he actually say? That's the tricky part. Allegedly, Lowe never accused anyone directly. He reportedly spoke in generalities, commenting on neighborhood harmony, privacy expectations, or the importance of respect among residents. Yet in the age of soundbites, nuance is often stripped away. Words like respect and boundaries can become interpreted as criticisms. Silence can be construed as judgment. And just like that, a narrative forms that may diverge from what was actually said. Here's an analogy. Imagine a calm river. A pebble falls into it. Not much happens at first. But when the pebble is magnified by sunlight, reflected in nearby water, and noticed by every observer on the bank, the ripples suddenly feel enormous. Allegedly, that's how Lowe's involvement transformed the story. A single voice, amplified by reputation and media coverage, turned private tension into public curiosity. And that's where social dynamics collide with perception. In communities like Montecito, people are highly attuned to the opinions of influential neighbors. If someone respected in the social hierarchy suggests that there may be tension, suddenly everyone is watching for evidence, interpreting actions through a heightened lens, and recalibrating their own behavior. Allegedly, this is exactly what happened after Lowe's commentary entered the discussion. Emotional spikes were immediate. Supporters of the alleged victim narrative felt vindicated. Critics claimed exaggeration. Neutral neighbors, unsure of whom to believe, experienced stress, what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. They were torn between wanting to maintain harmony and feeling the need to respond to perceived disruptions. Allegedly, that tension escalated social pressure, making it harder for any one individual to maintain calm or clarity. Audience question. If a neighbor whom everyone respects implies there's wrongdoing, would you trust your own judgment or theirs? In Montecito, the alleged answer was complicated. Residents reportedly felt caught between loyalty, caution, and fear of being on the wrong side of social perception. Every action or inaction was scrutinized. Every complaint or silence became part of the narrative. And yet, Lowe's alleged statements weren't just influential locally. Media coverage ensured that they reached a much wider audience. Suddenly, the alleged Montecito drama wasn't just contained within a gated community. It was being reported nationally, debated online, and dissected in celebrity commentary shows. The implications of what was happening, or what people thought was happening, were now amplified far beyond the immediate context. At the same time, there was an ironic twist. Lowe's reputation for discretion meant that many expected him to avoid involvement altogether. But his reported general remarks were interpreted as highly significant. Allegedly, this shows how fragile public narratives can be. Even vague comments can become definitive when amplified by media attention and the reputational weight of the speaker. But let's be clear, Lowe didn't initiate the controversy. Allegedly, he entered a conversation that was already in motion. The drone reports, the whispers about neighborhood bullying, the alleged discomfort among neighbors, those were already creating tension. His alleged statements acted as a catalyst, giving the story more traction and bringing the private speculation into public awareness. And that brings us to a fascinating question. When does commentary become validation? When does influence unintentionally escalate drama? Allegedly, in Montecito, Lowe's involvement illustrates the delicate balance in high-profile communities between observation, discretion, and interpretation. Another critical factor was timing. Allegedly, Lowe's comments came at a moment when rumors were reaching a critical mass. By that point, the drones, perceived bullying, and neighborhood tension had already been circulating quietly. His voice, measured and respected, created a focal point. Suddenly, speculation had a credible anchor. Allegedly, this is when social dynamics and media amplification combined to create a perfect storm. Audience question: if you were in a community where someone's general remarks could be interpreted as judgment, how would you react? Would you seek clarification, remain silent, or let assumptions grow? Allegedly, neighbors responded in all three ways, creating a complex web of tension, interpretation, and rumor. The stakes escalated further when social media entered the fray. Screenshots, quotes, and interpretations circulated. Every post fueled the narrative, and each new share magnified the story. Allegedly, this online amplification made private discomfort feel public, increasing pressure on neighbors to respond or act. And here's a surprising fact. Research in group psychology shows that communities with high visibility and social stakes often interpret ambiguous behavior more negatively than low visibility groups. Allegedly, this principle was evident in Montecito. Every glance, every comment, every drone sighting became symbolic, interpreted as evidence of control or intimidation, whether or not it was intended that way. By the end of this phase, alleged bullying claims were no longer private disputes. They were part of a public narrative. Lowe's role, while indirect, made the story appear credible to outsiders. Suddenly, Montecito wasn't just a peaceful enclave. It was the backdrop of a potential scandal, a social drama involving perception, privacy, and influence. And yet, the most dramatic chapter had not yet arrived. Allegedly, the culmination of these tensions, the drones, the whispers, the media amplification, the respected commentary, would create a scenario that some claimed amounted to an eviction or forced relocation. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What does it mean to be accused of bullying in one of the wealthiest, most private neighborhoods in the world? The word itself carries immediate emotional weight: aggression, intimidation, coercion. But in Montecito, bullying allegedly wasn't about shouting matches or physical threats. It was subtle, insidious, and sometimes procedural. A raised eyebrow, a pointed email, a polite but firm suggestion that everyone conform to unspoken rules. Allegedly, that's how neighbors began to perceive the behavior of one resident, and why whispers escalated into public speculation. Imagine living on a street where every interaction is analyzed. In a community like Montecito, social norms are powerful. Courtesy and discretion are paramount. A small deviation can be interpreted as a challenge to the established balance. Allegedly, that deviation became framed as bullying. Some neighbors reportedly felt pressured to adjust their own behavior, to avoid confrontation, or to comply with perceived expectations. But why would anyone in such a community feel bullied? According to claims circulating online and in media reports, the alleged bullying involved more than simple interpersonal friction. Neighbors reportedly noticed patterns. Repeated complaints about minor details, persistent observations of property and activity, and what some interpreted as subtle forms of social control. A request here, a correction there. Actions that might seem ordinary to an outsider could feel like harassment in the intimate, high-stakes ecosystem of Montecito. Here's an analogy. Imagine a chessboard where every move is strategic, even the smallest pawn. Allegedly, in Montecito, residents interpreted behaviors as deliberate maneuvers intended to assert control or dominance. Even neutral acts could be perceived as aggressive when framed through a lens of fear or suspicion. The drone sightings, for example, were said to exacerbate the perception of bullying. A device hovering over private property can feel intrusive. Allegedly, neighbors interpreted these sightings as evidence of monitoring or intimidation. In their view, the actions were not random. They were part of a pattern that contributed to an environment of pressure and unease. Emotional spikes emerged naturally. In high-status communities, reputations are fragile. Feeling monitored, judged, or coerced, even subtly, can create intense emotional responses. Some neighbors reportedly expressed frustration. Others allegedly tried to remain neutral. But neutrality, in a narrative fueled by media and speculation, can be interpreted as consent or complicity. This social dynamic allegedly intensified the perception of bullying, creating a feedback loop. Fear and suspicion prompted defensive actions, which in turn were seen as further evidence of conflict. Audience question: have you ever felt judged or pressured by subtle social cues? Multiply that by thousands of times in a neighborhood where privacy, wealth, and social reputation are paramount, and you begin to understand why alleged bullying in Montecito carried such weight. The media played a role as well. Sensational headlines often collapsed complex social dynamics into simple narratives. "She bullied the neighborhood" became a tagline, repeated across articles, podcasts, and social platforms. Allegedly, this framing gave legitimacy to the claims in the public eye, even as details remained unverified or disputed. A phrase, once amplified, shaped perception, turning whispers into a story that demanded attention. And then there's the paradox of power. Allegedly, the resident at the center of these claims was seen as both influential and vulnerable. Influence can intimidate, even unintentionally, and vulnerability can invite scrutiny. When neighbors interpreted actions as deliberate attempts to control or manipulate, the narrative of bullying took shape. The interplay of perceived power and social expectation is central to understanding how subtle behaviors can escalate in tight-knit, high-status communities. Consider the psychological dimension. Humans are wired to detect patterns and assign meaning, especially when stakes are high. In Montecito, the stakes are immense. Social cohesion, property values, personal privacy, and reputation. Allegedly, even small actions that would be ignored elsewhere were interpreted as evidence of a systematic pattern of intimidation. And in a neighborhood where appearances matter more than words, perception often outweighs intention. Allegedly, communications between neighbors, emails, texts, casual comments, were scrutinized repeatedly. Every interaction was filtered through the lens of the alleged bullying claims. What might have been polite corrections became evidence of coercion. What might have been ordinary oversight became interpreted as surveillance or manipulation. The emotional intensity grew as each act, whether intended or not, was interpreted through accumulated suspicion. Another factor, the speed at which rumors travel. In Montecito, as in any high-profile community, private concerns quickly enter public discourse. Allegedly, conversations that began on quiet street corners or in neighborly chats were amplified by social media, blogs, and celebrity news outlets. Each retelling reinforced the narrative, creating a sense that the alleged bullying was both pervasive and undeniable. And yet, ambiguity remained. Allegedly, some neighbors saw the behavior as normal, polite, or inconsequential. Others felt genuinely threatened or manipulated. The conflicting perspectives created a fog of interpretation. Media coverage, meanwhile, often emphasized the most dramatic reports, giving outsiders the impression that a clear pattern existed, even when first-hand experiences were varied and nuanced. Emotional spikes were unavoidable. Readers, viewers, and online commenters reacted viscerally to the framing of bullying. Anger, sympathy, disbelief, and judgment coexisted in the narrative. Allegedly, some neighbors themselves experienced stress, anxiety, and social pressure as the story gained traction. A neighborhood dispute that might have remained private became a public spectacle, with reputations on the line. Audience question: can bullying be invisible? Can it be legal, polite, or subtle, but still hurtful? Allegedly, in Montecito, residents felt that the answer was yes. The alleged bullying was not about loud arguments or public confrontations. It was about influence, observation, expectation, and the subtle enforcement of social norms in a high-pressure, high-visibility community. As the alleged bullying claims circulated, a deeper question emerged. Who truly held power in this situation? Was it the alleged instigator of the behavior, with influence and visibility, or the collective neighbors, whose reactions, complaints, and interpretations could shape the narrative? Allegedly, the tension between individual authority and communal response is central to understanding why this story escalated as it did. And just when it seemed like the narrative might plateau, the question of relocation, or alleged eviction entered the conversation. Allegedly, some neighbors suggested that the tensions had become intolerable. Allegedly, some claimed that the pressure reached a point where remaining in the neighborhood was no longer feasible for one resident. The alleged bullying, combined with perceived surveillance and social pressure, culminated in a scenario that became public speculation. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Imagine hearing the word eviction in a neighborhood like Montecito. Eviction. The very term evokes force, authority, and public humiliation. Yet in this story, the word allegedly used to describe what happened was hotly debated. Was it an eviction? A voluntary exit? A relocation framed dramatically by outsiders? The distinction is critical. And yet, the line between perception and reality is often blurry, especially when headlines are involved. In high-profile communities, language carries weight. One word can define the narrative. Allegedly, reports circulated that a resident, allegedly Meghan Markle, was evicted following tensions with neighbors over alleged drone surveillance and bullying behavior. That word immediately conjures a scenario of coercion, conflict, and legal authority. But according to other accounts, no official eviction notice existed. Instead, what allegedly occurred was a departure, framed by rumor, speculation, and selective reporting as a forced removal. Here's the paradox. In Montecito, privacy and image are everything. Residents go to great lengths to maintain control over how their lives appear to the public and to neighbors. Allegedly, even small misunderstandings can spiral into massive stories if language is misapplied or interpreted aggressively. Eviction implies judgment. Exit implies choice. And once a term appears in print, the perception tends to solidify faster than facts can clarify it. Think of it like this. Two neighbors leave a community under similar circumstances. One is labeled evicted in headlines, the other relocated voluntarily. Emotionally, publicly, and socially, the two exits are interpreted entirely differently, even if the actual actions are identical. In Montecito, according to claims, this linguistic framing fueled debate, social pressure, and public scrutiny. Allegedly, part of the confusion came from private communications that were misinterpreted or leaked. Emails, messages, and informal discussions among neighbors reportedly were circulated selectively. Phrases suggesting tension were presented to the public as formal complaints or demands. Suddenly, a private disagreement was reframed as a community-wide mandate. And the media, hungry for drama, ran with the most sensational phrasing, eviction. This is where perception can become reality. Once eviction appeared in articles, social media posts, and commentary, the public imagination took over. Allegedly, audiences inferred confrontation, conflict, and coercion, even in the absence of any verified legal action. The subtlety of voluntary departure versus forced removal was lost amid dramatic storytelling. Emotional stakes were high. Readers, viewers, and online audiences immediately aligned with one narrative or another. Supporters of the alleged bullying narrative believed eviction confirmed wrongdoing. Skeptics argued that language had been weaponized to manipulate perception. And neighbors, caught in the middle, faced immense social pressure, public curiosity, and internal conflict. Audience question: if your departure from a neighborhood were labeled eviction without your consent, how would you respond? Would you feel anger, humiliation, or indifference? In Montecito, allegedly, residents had to navigate exactly that dilemma, managing not just their own reality, but the public perception of their actions. The drone allegations added a new dimension to this linguistic battle. Allegedly, the presence of drones had already generated suspicion, creating the context in which minor actions could be interpreted as coercive. A quiet request, a polite observation, or a casual interaction was reframed as part of a larger pattern of pressure, feeding the narrative of bullying and eviction. Psychology plays a huge role here. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures. When headlines declare that someone was evicted amid ongoing tension, readers fill in gaps. They imagine confrontations, threats, and legal actions, even if none occurred. Allegedly, that's exactly how the Montecito narrative intensified. Social dynamics within the neighborhood also contributed. Allegedly, some residents believed that remaining silent would protect them socially. while others felt compelled to speak up to assert their perspective. Each action, or inaction, was scrutinized, interpreted, and sometimes misrepresented, creating a feedback loop of tension and speculation. Legal context further complicates the story. Even in high-profile areas, formal eviction requires specific processes: notices, filings, and legal authority. According to reports, there were no public records of such actions. Yet the use of the word eviction persisted in media and social commentary. This contrast between technical reality and public narrative illustrates the power of language to shape perception, especially when amplified by celebrity, influence, and rumor. Allegedly, this is why language wars matter. In Montecito, a single term, eviction, transformed a potentially private dispute into a national conversation. The emotional resonance of the word, combined with ongoing drone allegations, media amplification, and commentary from respected figures like Lowe, created a story that felt inevitable, even if the legal facts were ambiguous. Audience question: how much power does language have in shaping reality? Can one word define a story, regardless of facts? In Montecito, allegedly, the answer was yes. The perception of eviction became more important than the actual circumstances surrounding the departure. And here's the irony. The alleged use of the term eviction may have been intended to explain a situation, but it ultimately escalated the narrative. What might have been a private, low-profile resolution became fodder for national media, online speculation, and social commentary. Allegedly, the language itself intensified the emotional stakes, making reconciliation or clarification nearly impossible. As tensions peaked, neighbors reportedly felt a mix of relief, vindication, and anxiety. The alleged departure, or eviction, solved some conflicts but created new ones. Social dynamics shifted. Patterns of behavior were scrutinized more intensely than ever, and the neighborhood's reputation as a peaceful enclave was questioned publicly for the first time. But even after all of this, ambiguity remained. Allegedly, the questions lingered. Was the departure voluntary? Was it coerced? Was it influenced by social pressure, perceived surveillance, or miscommunication? The public, the media, and the community all had their interpretations, and each interpretation fueled further speculation. And just when it seemed the story might settle into ambiguity, new details emerged. Allegedly, further neighbor reactions, media analysis, and commentary would push the narrative into even more controversial territory, raising questions about privacy, influence, and the limits of social tolerance. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. In today's world, a story doesn't exist until it's shared, clicked, and commented on. In Montecito, a quiet, gated community designed for privacy, the alleged tensions involving drones, perceived bullying, and an eviction quickly transcended the neighborhood's boundaries. Once the media entered the picture, what was private became public, subtle became sensational, and speculation became narrative. Think about how media works. Headlines are designed to grab attention. A word like bullied or evicted has immediate emotional weight. Allegedly, in the Montecito story, these terms were repeated, reshaped, and amplified by outlets hungry for clicks and engagement. A small dispute among neighbors became a nationwide story in hours. Every sentence was dissected, every word weighed, and every claim treated as evidence, even when verification was scarce. According to reports, coverage varied widely. Some outlets emphasized alleged drone surveillance, framing it as deliberate harassment. Others highlighted alleged bullying, portraying it as a calculated pattern of behavior. Social media amplified the most sensational claims, often stripping away nuance. Allegedly, by the time the story reached mainstream news, a narrative had formed that was more dramatic than the underlying events might suggest. Here's an emotional spike. Imagine being a resident of Montecito reading headlines that claim you've been evicted, bullied your neighbors, or disrupted community peace. Even if the reports are inaccurate or exaggerated, the perception becomes reality in the public eye. Allegedly, this media amplification increased stress, uncertainty, and anxiety among residents, turning personal disputes into public spectacle. Audience question: if a private disagreement became a viral story overnight, how would it affect your sense of safety, privacy, and reputation? In Montecito, allegedly, the answer was clear. Many residents felt exposed, vulnerable, and misrepresented. The media frenzy didn't just report, it shaped behavior. Allegedly, residents adjusted their interactions, tightened security, and monitored communication, fearing that even minor actions could be interpreted as confirmation of the sensational narrative. Social dynamics shifted, reinforcing tension. A single drone sighting, a polite disagreement, or a neutral comment could suddenly be perceived as validation of the story. Psychologically, this is fascinating. Humans respond more strongly to perceived threats when they are magnified publicly. Allegedly, the combination of private tension and public scrutiny created a feedback loop. Anxiety fueled interpretation, interpretation fueled rumor, and rumor fueled more coverage. In other words, the media didn't just report the story, it actively participated in shaping its escalation. Social media played an even more volatile role. Screenshots, commentary, opinion threads, and video clips circulated rapidly. Allegedly, every new post added another layer of complexity. Opinions hardened. Assumptions became facts in the minds of viewers. A single comment by a neighbor, amplified online, could validate one side of the narrative while vilifying the other. And then came celebrity commentary. High-profile figures and influencers, already invested in stories involving Meghan Markle, reportedly weighed in, adding legitimacy or controversy to the narrative. Each new voice intensified public interest and scrutiny, expanding the story far beyond Montecito's gates. Allegedly, a community dispute transformed into a cultural talking point, dissected by millions. Here's a twist. The media frenzy also influenced the perception of events that had occurred before coverage even began. Allegedly, neighbors' prior complaints, minor tensions, and observations were retroactively reframed to fit the emerging narrative. Suddenly, past actions were interpreted through the lens of alleged bullying and surveillance, creating a story that felt inevitable, even if its beginnings were subtle.